You should have this chart. This shows the four mothers of the children of Jacob. From left to right, Leah, which was his first wife, Zilpah, who was Leah's handmaid, Rachel, which was his second wife, which was the one he actually did all the work for and the one he expected to marry, and Bilhah was her handmaid. And I've put them on here. The lines help you to see the order of birth, and that'll be significant when we get to that point. On the other side is a map of the land of Egypt and the area where they will be traveling during the 20 years wandering. And as we go through this study, I will be adding in places where they're going so we can follow them and see where they went. Now, in order to understand the full impact of what's taught in Exodus, we need to go back and review some of what happened in Genesis. Jacob, who is the father, who is also called Israel, he was the son of Isaac, the grandson of Abraham. He had a rather tenuous relationship with people. Like his father and his grandfather, he had a tendency to be less than honest with people. His name, Jacob, means supplanter, or he who takes the place of another. We'll see in just a moment why that's appropriate for him. Now we read in Genesis chapter 25 that even in his mother's womb, he was wrestling with his brother Esau. Then later in this chapter, we'll learn that, later in that chapter, we learn that Jacob actually bought his birthright from Esau. Esau had the right of the firstborn, but Jacob bought that from him one day when Esau came in from hunting and he was famished, and Jacob had some stew there, and he wanted to eat really bad, and Jacob said, okay, sell me your birthright and I'll give you some. So he did. Later in chapter 27, we learn that Jacob and his mother Rebekah then tricked the father Isaac into giving Jacob the firstborn's blessing instead of Esau. And they went to extreme means to fool Isaac into thinking this is his firstborn when it wasn't. So he stole the blessing from Esau. They knew that Esau would be angry. So as soon as that happened, Jacob and his mother got together and sent him off to her brother Laban, who was up in Mesopotamia. While he was there, he agreed to work 7 years for Laban's daughter Rachel. So he worked 7 years for Laban, and then that night he was given not Rachel, but Leah, and he didn't notice it until after they had done their thing. And the next morning when he realized what happened, he went back to Laban and he said, you tricked me. Laban said, look, around here it's not right for us to give the second daughter before the first daughter. So work another 7 years for me and I'll give you Rachel as well. So he did that. When he came back some 20 years later, God had instructed him to go back to his homeland, and as he knew he was approaching Esau, in fact, he sent scouts on ahead, and they said, Esau is coming towards you to meet you. And of course, he was quite afraid of Esau, so he divided up all of his people and sent them in groups, and provided also a present of a bunch of his flocks to Esau. But before he took off, he spent the night at a place called Peniel, and there he wrestled with God that night. Now, it seems unusual for us to think of anybody wrestling with God, although we do it all the time. We just do it mentally and emotionally. He did it physically, and that means that this God he wrestled with was Jesus Christ pre-incarnate, because that's the only physical manifestation of God, is Jesus Christ himself. So he was wrestling with God, and God eventually put his hip out of joint. And God said to Jacob, what's your name? And he said, Jacob. God said, it will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, which means he who wrestles with God. Then Jacob asked God, "What is your name?" But God didn't answer him. Instead, he blessed him. So the following day, Jacob, like I said, divided up his family into groups and sent them on ahead of him, along with the gift. And as Esau saw Jacob coming, Jacob bowed down to the ground before Esau. But Esau just ran up to him and hugged him and welcomed him, unlike what Jacob was expecting. And then Esau said, "What's the meaning of all these that you have sent on ahead of you?" Jacob said, "Please accept my blessing that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me and because I have enough." Thus he urged him, and he took it. Well, Esau then agreed or offered to travel back to Esau's home with Jacob so that they could be together. But Jacob said, "No, because of the children and the flocks that will have to travel slowly, it would just take too much time. So you go on and I'll follow you." Well, remember, Jacob meant he who supplants or takes the place of another. He also was dishonest. So instead of going on to Esau, he turned aside and went over to Shechem. When Jacob and his family were living there in Shechem, the man Shechem, who was the son of Hamor, who was the leader of all those people, he saw Jacob's daughter Dinah, and he wanted her. And so he forced himself on her and actually raped her. Then he sent his father Hamor to Jacob to say, "I want your daughter Dinah to be my wife, my son's wife." But by that time, the brothers had heard what happened. And they came in and they said to Hamor, "We cannot intermarry with people who are uncircumcised." So Hamor and Shechem went back to the city and convinced all of the men of the city to get circumcised so that they could intermarry. 3 days later, when the men were extremely sore, several of Jacob's sons, in each case brothers of Dinah, went to Shechem and killed every man there and plundered the city, which brought a terrible reputation to Jacob, which is why he fled that area. Now, through Jacob's 2 wives and their maidservants, he ended up fathering 12 sons. 2 of them, Joseph and Benjamin, if you'll look here, were born to Rachel, which was Jacob's favorite wife. Rachel died giving birth to Benjamin, who was the youngest of all of them. So both Benjamin and Joseph were very special to Jacob. One day when Joseph was out in the field with some of his brothers, he had a dream. And he said, "Here's my dream. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf rose up and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers recognized that in the dream they were bowing down to Joseph. So they said, "Are you indeed going to reign over us? Are you indeed going to rule over us?" Then he dreamed another dream. In this dream, he said, "I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars are bowing down to me." Now, they all recognized that was a reference to his father, his mother, and his 11 brothers. So when he told his father and his brothers, Jacob said, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow down ourselves to the ground before you?" And we know, in fact, that that's exactly what happened. Now, in spite of all this, as I said, Joseph was Jacob's favorite. And he gave him the infamous coat of many colors. It was a sign that he was the heir apparent for that family. It was giving him special honor. Well, eventually his brothers got so jealous of Joseph, he probably brought some of that on himself. He probably tended to be a little bit arrogant. And so when a band of Ishmaelites came through, the brothers threw Joseph into a pit, first of all, probably an abandoned well. And then as the Ishmaelites came by, they agreed to sell him to the Ishmaelites to take down as a slave in Egypt. Now, let me step aside a second and say, as Joseph was being taken down into Egypt, he surely thought, my dad's wealthy, I'm his favorite son, he will come after me. And he expected his father and an army to show up at any time. What he didn't know was that the brothers had taken his coat and dipped it in blood of an animal, took it to their father Jacob and say, we don't know whose this is, but he was destroyed by a wild animal. So Jacob believed that Joseph was dead. That's why he didn't go after him. Well, when he was down in Egypt, he was purchased as a slave by the captain of the guard, whose name was Potiphar. And Potiphar noticed that everything that Joseph did turned out well. Whatever he put his hand to was blessed by God. So Potiphar put Joseph in charge of all of his goods, all of his household. In fact, everything except his wife was under Joseph's control. Well, apparently Joseph was fairly attractive, and Potiphar's wife decided that she wanted to get together with him. So she tried to seduce Joseph, but he refused. He said, look, you're the only thing in this household that's not under my control. I'm not going to betray my owner, my boss. And he ran away, but she grabbed his coat as he ran away. So when Potiphar came home, she told him, this man whose coat I have here tried to rape me. And so Potiphar threw him in prison. So now Joseph, not only has his father not come for him, but he now has been doing a good job, and as a result of it, gets thrown into prison. While he was in prison, he met up with two of Pharaoh's employees, the baker and the cupbearer. Now, the baker is important because he baked a lot of Pharaoh's goods. The cupbearer was even more important because the cupbearer is the one who tasted all the food and all the drink before Pharaoh did, in case somebody had tried to poison Pharaoh. It would be the cupbearer who died and not the Pharaoh. So he was extremely important. These two got to know Joseph, and one night they each had a dream. And they went to Joseph and they said, we had these dreams. We don't know who can interpret them. Joseph said, God can interpret them. Tell me your dreams and I'll tell you what they mean. So he predicted that the baker would be executed and the cupbearer would be restored to his position. And he told the cupbearer, when you're restored to your position, don't forget about me. Well, he did. He forgot all about Joseph. And it wasn't until 2 years later, Joseph is still languishing in prison. 2 years later, Pharaoh had a dream. And none of his magicians could interpret the dream for him. That was a time when the cupbearer remembered what Joseph had done. And he said, Pharaoh, there is a man I know, I met in prison. He can interpret dreams. So Pharaoh called Joseph. Joseph was cleaned up and came before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh, incidentally, Pharaoh had asked all his magicians to interpret the dream, and they couldn't. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, will you interpret this dream for me? And again, Joseph said, I can't interpret dreams, but God can. So tell me your dream, and I'll interpret it for you. And we know, of course, that the dream indicated that there were going to be 7 years of plenty in Egypt, followed by 7 years of famine. And Joseph said to Pharaoh, therefore find yourself a wise man and put him in charge of all the food to get you through this time of fame and famine. Pharaoh said, who is there any wiser than you, Joseph? I'm putting you in charge of all of Egypt. Only I will be greater than you in this nation. Well, meanwhile, back in Canaan, Joseph's father and brothers were running out of food, so they sent 10 brothers down to get some food. Now, they didn't send Benjamin because Jacob, again, was afraid of losing him. And, of course, Joseph was already there. Joseph recognized his brothers when they came, but they didn't recognize him, probably because he was dressed as an Egyptian, looked a bit different. So he asked the brothers about their family. He said, "Do you have any other brothers? How is your father?" And he said that they had an elderly father and one more brother. Then, and this seems strange in the context, or out of context, immediately Joseph accused them of being spies. Well, this was part of Joseph's plan. He put them in custody, and 3 days later he went to them and said, "Look, I'm a God-fearing man, so if you will do this, one of you stay here in custody, and the rest of them go back to your father, and bring him and your son and your brother back to me." So the brothers, Simeon, who's the second oldest, said, "Okay, I'll stay, and the others can go." Now, when the brothers were heading back, Joseph said to his steward, "I want you to take their money that they brought and put it back in their sacks with their grain." So as they were traveling back, they opened up their sacks to feed their animals, and they noticed their money. And of course, that scared them to death because they could be accused of robbing. So when the food finally ran out again, Jacob told them, "Brothers, boys, you've got to go back and get some more food." And they said, "But the man in Egypt," who was their brother Joseph, "had told them, 'You shall not see my face unless your brother is with you.'" So Jacob had no choice but to send Benjamin. Judah then said, "I will pledge my life for Benjamin's safe return." So the brothers returned to Egypt, and when Joseph saw the brothers, including Benjamin, he told his steward to bring the men up to his house. Now this was very unusual. A high official does not invite foreigners up to their house unless it's to sabotage them or to try to murder them. When they sat down to eat, Joseph asked them if their father was still alive, and they replied, "Your servant, our father, is well. He is still alive." Then between learning that his father was alive and seeing his youngest brother, Joseph was so overcome with emotion that he excused himself and went out to a separate room to cry. We don't think of Joseph, the leader of Egypt, as crying, but he was so emotionally overcome that he did. Then he told the steward again to put their money back in their sacks before he sent them off. And shortly after they left, he sent people on after them. And when the cup was found in Benjamin's sack, all the brothers fell down before Joseph. Then Judah said to Joseph, "What shall we say to my lord? What shall we speak, or how can we clear ourselves? God has found out the guilt of your servants. Behold, we are my lord's servants, both we and he also in whose hand the cup has been found." He was saying, "We're bowing down to you. We're your servants now," just as Joseph's first dream had indicated. So Judah then stood forth again and said, "Look, I've pledged my life for the son. Please keep me and let him go back to his father." But Joseph couldn't control himself. He sent all the Egyptians out of the room, and then he called his brothers over and revealed himself. Here's what he said. "And Joseph said to his brothers, 'I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?' But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. So Joseph said to his brothers, 'Come near to me, please.' And they came near, and he said, 'I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt.'" What was the one distinguishing characteristic of a child of Abraham that distinguished him from every other nation on earth. Circumcision. You notice Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." Now at this point it was just Joseph and his brothers. And I believe he revealed himself to his brothers. Now we think that might be a little weird, but in that society, nudity was considered something fairly normal. So when Joseph revealed himself to his brothers and they saw he was circumcised, they knew right away that it must be their brother. Then as a result, Joseph ordered that wagons be sent to his father and all his father's household and had them brought back to Egypt as shepherds. Well, why did they come as shepherds? Well, because Joseph had gone to Pharaoh and said, "My family is alive and I've sent wagons to come and bring them." And Pharaoh said, "What kind of work do your family do?" And he said, "They're shepherds." And that's when Pharaoh said, "Then have them go to the land of Goshen." And if you look at your map here, you see that Goshen is up in the Nile Delta, the most fertile area in the country, the best place for animals. And Pharaoh said also, "If there are any of your brothers who are especially good as shepherds, have them tend my sheep as well." So they end up being settled in the land of Goshen. That brings us up to chapter 1 of Exodus. And it starts out, "These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob." And I want you to look at this list as I read these names off, and it starts up here. Each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin. You notice he's gone right down in order, birth order of the daughters of Leah, and then down to Benjamin, the son of Rachel. That was intentional. Then he said, Dan and Naphtali, over here, and Gad and Asher. Again, they're in birth order, but these are the children of the handmaids. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now there arises a problem regarding the number of people who went into Egypt when you compare this with Stephen's testimony. Remember, Stephen stood before the Sanhedrin and he said, "And Joseph sent and summoned Jacob his father and all his kindred, 75 persons in all." Well, was it 70 or was it 75? The Bible can't contradict itself, so what's the problem here? Well, we have to understand that Stephen, along with the rest of the disciples of Christ, read their Old Testament from the Septuagint, the Greek version, because Greek was the language of the whole world at that time. So they read it from the Septuagint, and the Septuagint says 75, whereas the text we call the Masoretic text said 70. Now, there are some who claim that the 75 includes 3 grandsons and 2 great-grandsons of Joseph, but there's really no evidence of that. So, looking at the Masoretic text in Genesis 46, it says, "All the persons belonging to Jacob who came into Egypt, who were his own descendants, not including Jacob's sons' wives," that's important, "were 66 persons in all. And the sons of Joseph who were born to him in Egypt were 2, that would be 68. All the persons of the house of Jacob who came into Egypt were 70. Well, Joseph would be 69, but 69 isn't 70. Where's the disconnect here? In the Septuagint, in Genesis 46:26, after giving the 66, it adds, "And the sons of Joseph born in Egypt were 9 souls." That 9 added to 66 gets to 75. We don't know if he had that many grandsons or not because Scripture doesn't tell us anywhere. But in Genesis 46, 8 through 25, In verse 20 particularly, it states, "And to Joseph in the land of Egypt were born Manasseh and Ephraim, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On, bore to him." Bear with me here. It said in Genesis 46, "All the persons belonging to Jacob who came into Egypt, who were his own descendants, not including Jacob's sons' wives, were 66 persons." Okay? So the wives weren't included because they were women of the land of Canaan. They weren't descendants of Jacob. Okay. But here, in verse 25, "And to Joseph in the land of Egypt were born Manasseh and Ephraim, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On, bore to him." Who is Asenath? Well, he was the daughter of Potiphar, so she must have been an Egyptian. Well, ancient Hebrew scribes have always upheld the tradition that Asenath was the daughter of Dinah, who had been raped by Shechem. And because she was an illegitimate child, she was sold to Egypt. And she became Potiphar's daughter. So in this recounting, she would also be a descendant of Joseph. That's the 70th person that came with him. Okay. Verse 6. Now is where it gets interesting. "Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them." Now we know in Exodus 12, 37 and 38, we find out that when they left Egypt, there were 600,000 men in Israel. Now, if there are 600,000 men, there surely were an equal number of women. So there's another 600,000. That's 1.2 million. And assuming each couple had only 2 children, which is probably more than that, but assuming they only had 2, that would bring us up to 2.4 million people total. So when they left Egypt, they left somewhere between 2 and 3 million people. Verse 8, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph." Egyptologists have debated this for years as to which pharaoh this was. Possibly it was Akhenaten, who was a predecessor to Tutankhamun. Or maybe it was Ramesses II, or it may be by virtue of the fact that the term "a new king" likely refers to a new dynasty. Maybe it was Ahmose, who was the first ruler of the 18th dynasty. However, it's more likely that it was Thutmose III, and we'll see this later. Now it says he did not know Joseph. Now, any pharaoh, when he comes into power, would have access to all of the historical documents that have been prepared, and it talks about previous rulers. So he could have known quite a bit about Joseph. But he apparently didn't agree with the way Joseph ran things. "And this new king said to his people, 'Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land.'" What was his fear of the Israelites? That they would join his enemies and fight against him. He wasn't afraid that they would defeat him. He was afraid that they would join his enemies, fight against him, and then emancipate themselves, leave the land of Egypt. And he didn't want that because they were his free slaves. Therefore, verse 11, "They set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramesses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad, and the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel." You see, Pharaoh thought if he worked them really hard, then 2 things would happen. First of all, they would be so tired and weak that they wouldn't revolt. And secondly, that they would not have as much desire to procreate. What he didn't realize, and what we know today, is that the more a person has worked, the stronger they get, not the weaker. And we also know that men who have work at very heavy physical labor produce extra testosterone, which makes them want to reproduce more. So what he was doing here, instead of trying to suppress the Israelites, was causing them to become even greater. Now, incidentally, it probably was God's intent that this happened, because remember, for the next 40 years, these Israelites were going to be wandering through the wilderness. They needed to be strong people. Verse 13, so they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service, in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. And all their work they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. It's interesting to note that more bricks have been discovered bearing the name Thutmose III, who was thought by some to be the king of Egypt at the time of the Exodus, than any other name. This also leads credence to the notion that the king who did not know Joseph was of the 18th dynasty, of which Thutmose III was fifth in succession. So that probably was Thutmose III. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, the other Puah, when you serve as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. Now, at the time just before the Exodus, as we said, there were probably 2.4 or more million Jews, and they probably had births of children at the rate of 40 or 50 per day. Two midwives could not handle that, so they obviously had other midwives. Now, according to Adam Clarke in his commentary on the Bible, he said, here's an explanation of why Pharaoh did this. Jonathan ben Uzziel gives us a curious reason for the command given by Pharaoh to the Egyptian women. Pharaoh slept and saw in his sleep a balance, and behold, the whole land of Egypt stood on one scale, and a lamb on the other. Curious that it was a lamb, right? And the scale in which the lamb was outweighed that in which the land of Egypt. Immediately he sent and called all the chief magicians and told them his dream. And Jannes and Jambres, if you've read 2 Timothy 3:8, you recognize those names, opened their mouths and said to Pharaoh, a child is shortly to be born in the congregation of the Israelites, whose hand shall destroy the whole land of Egypt. Therefore Pharaoh spoke to the midwives, etc. So we see that God was already preparing for the Messiah to come. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this, and let the male children live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. It's possible that they told a lie to the most powerful men in the whole earth. It's possible. Not likely. It's more likely that these Israel women, because of the hard work they did all the time, had much easier labors. And as an expression of how that might work, the nomadic Arabian women today have quite rapid and comparatively easy childbirth, very likely owing to the strenuous life that they live. So there's an example that maybe these women gave birth quickly before the midwife could arrive because they were so strong. Verse 20, so God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong, and because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Now, it's not because of their explanation to the king, but their fear of God that he dealt well with them. Verse 22, then Pharaoh commanded all his people, Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Okay, he's been thwarted twice. He's going to take care of the problem once and for all now. So he tells all the Egyptian people, if you see a newborn Hebrew boy, kill him, throw him into the Nile. So what? Let me ask you first, there are some heroes in this story. Who do you recognize as heroes? Obviously the midwives. Yeah. Now in the introduction, Joseph may have been considered a hero, but in this part, it's clearly the midwives. What was it about them that brought God's blessing on them? Was it their obedience? In Exodus 1:20, it says, so God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. It's not their obedience, that is, observing a list of commandments, that had endeared them to God. Remember, the 10 Commandments hadn't been given yet. So it wasn't them obeying a law, but it was them fearing God. Do you have to believe in something to fear it? Well, absolutely. If you don't believe it exists, well, how can you be afraid of it? Solomon years later wrote these words, the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. But in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul spent the entire book of Galatians and most of the book of Romans explaining that we are no longer under the law, but under grace. And he summed it up this way. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not of your own doing, it is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. Now this, of course, is speaking of salvation and the works that we do as a result of our salvation. The real question is, what do we need to do today to receive God's blessing in this lifetime? Let me ask that again. What do we need to do today to receive God's blessings in this lifetime? The answer lies in the book of Hebrews. By faith, Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death, and he was not found, because God had taken him. Now before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. What was it about Enoch that caused God to take him directly into his presence without having to go through death's door? He pleased God. So we get down to the crux of the whole discussion. What does it take to please God? Is it obedience? That's what we normally think of. But look at what the next verse in Hebrews 11 says. And without faith, it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. The writer of Hebrews tells us that it takes two things to please God. First, we must believe that he is. That's the foundation of all faith. We must first believe that God exists and that he is who he says he is. The second thing that's necessary in order to receive God's blessing is that we must understand that he rewards those who seek him. Now this word seek is not the normal word for seek. The normal Greek word for seek would be zeteo. This word is exzeteo. A literal translation might be seek out, but the ek, which means out, is used as an emphasizer, to emphasize the verb. So it literally means to diligently seek out God and develop a relationship with him. Therefore, this says, and without faith it's impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who diligently seek him. What are you seeking after in this life? Is it money? Happiness? Stuff? Fame? Power? Or is it him? Do you truly seek God's presence in your life each day? It's only through this practice that we can guarantee that we'll be pleasing to him. Why should we want to please God? After all he did was send his only begotten Son to die on the cross so that we could have a relationship with him. My final question, my friends, is this. Are you pleasing God each day of your life? Are you at least trying to please God every day of your life? This is the true source of God's blessing in your life. Not to be obedient to him, not to do a bunch of things to make him like you more, but to believe what he tells us. That's what is pleasing to God. If you want God's blessing in your life, then you need to be diligently seeking him. I've told you before, our men's group meets every other week, and we've been going through a booklet on practicing the presence of God. And that's the crux of what he's saying here. We need to constantly be seeking out God in everything that we do and seeking to involve him in our lives, in every aspect of our life. That's the secret to God's blessing. Now, I know there are some people, and some who have been here at times, who have gone through some terrible things in their life recently, and have lost a child, and have had another succumb to drug addiction. And that person believes that God doesn't love them anymore. That's not the case. After all, if that was the case, Joseph would not have loved God, would he? Joseph was sold into slavery. Joseph was accused of a rape he didn't do. Joseph was left in prison after he was promised to be let out. But he still had a strong faith because he sought to please God in everything he does. Let's make that part of our daily walk. Let's seek every day to please God and to involve him in our lives.